This video is made possible by Dashlane. Dashlane is a one-stop-shop digital identity protection tool going beyond just an amazing password manager and providing identity protection, monitoring, restoration, and more. Visit dashlane.com/TodayIFoundOut and apply the promo code TodayIFoundOut for a 10% discount. And in the video today, we're answering a viewer question because Jill T asks, would you be able to explain what happens to people's money and property if they end up going to jail forever? Well, Jill, before you get started, I hope this is just personal curiosity rather than you trying to get practical information from us, but either way, here we go. Prison by design is a place where a number of your rights are either stripped away or are severely limited in some manner. The right most pertinent to the topic of conversation today is the ability to freely access your bank account and or manage any money or assets that you have. First, though, we should probably mention the distinction between jail and prison, as the terms are often erroneously used interchangeably. In a nutshell, jails generally serve to hold individuals who are awaiting a trial, and in the US they're typically run by county officers, whereas prisons hold those who've been sentenced, and they usually are run by prisons and correction officers in each state. As with all things in life, there are exceptions here. An individual sentenced to shorter sentences, usually less than a year, can be incarcerated in jails. Moving on, in the United States, with the exception of a few specific types of crime that we're going to discuss in more detail in a moment, upon being sentenced, absolutely nothing whatsoever will happen to your money, your property, or your assets. In fact, an often unforeseen downside of being arrested and being sent to prison is that you're still on the hook for all of the financial obligations that you're committed to prior to being arrested and sentenced, and that includes things like rent, bills, and of course any debt. But of course at this point you'll likely have lost any way to make any significant amount of money in order to pay the bills. So if you head to prison with a phone contract or even something like a Netflix subscription, that money will continue to be vacuumed out of your account each and every month. For this reason and others, many lawyers strongly advise getting your financial life, including settling any debts and getting rid of any bills you can, in order before any kind of potential prison sentence, to avoid an unnecessary loss of funds or leaving prison in a worse financial situation than when you entered it, which is extremely common. This can be difficult, however, for those who are suddenly arrested and unable to post bail in order to potentially have an interim period between jail and prison to get everything in order. Then again, depending on the amount of time that you're sentenced to serve, having something like a Netflix account or similar subscription that takes a very small amount of money from your account each month can actually be quite a good idea. The reason being that it is the policy of most banks to freeze accounts if no activity is recorded on it for a set amount of time. This varies from bank to bank, but around 6 to 12 months of inactivity seems to be a good ballpark figure for when this generally occurs. Further, if your account has been frozen for more than 15 years, at least in the UK, the government is allowed to take any money in such an account and distribute it to worthy causes, though technically you're still supposed to be able to recover the money even then if you happen to be able to track it down after all that time. On that note, if your account is frozen, a bank should have no problem unfreezing it, provided you can jump through the required hoops. The problem, of course, being that unfreezing an account from within prison is, from a practical standpoint, sometimes an effort in futility, with the best case scenario being that you'll be able to get the account unfrozen after many months of effort and help from someone on the outside. Thus, lawyers generally advise making nominal payments into or from an account while in prison to avoid this from happening. A problem here, of course, is that while in prison, in many regions of the world, you are forbidden or severely restricted to any direct access to any bank accounts that you have. This might all have you wondering, well, how do you make any payments or deposits from prison? Well, in the UK, prisoners are allowed to make limited banking transactions of a personal nature, provided they are to either help you maintain your personal affairs whilst in prison, or to help assist you to resume a regular lifestyle on release. For example, a British prisoner can issue checks, pay debts, and even authorize the sale of property or assets within reason, or even run a legitimate business in a limited capacity. However, there are often severe restrictions to access to telephone and internet banking, if access is given at all, meaning that for most inmates, banking has to be done by mail. It should also be noted here that access to mail and what correspondence are allowed in and out for a given inmate can often be severely restricted as well. In addition, most prisoners on both sides of the pond usually have access to special prison accounts which are usable within prison. This account can be used to buy things from the commissary like toiletries or even personal items like TVs or radios. This is all at the discretion of prison officials. In fact, if you ever do find yourself in prison in the United States and you want to watch a Today I Found Out video, you absolutely can, although it's at an exorbitant price that we have nothing to do with. Honestly, if it was up to us, we'd just give them away for free, and if you're in prison watching this, I'm very sorry that it's so damn expensive. Nonetheless, some inmates do choose to pay that exorbitant fee to watch our videos. To date, the most popular such video seems to be the video on the colourful life of Colonel Sanders, which, by the way, we go into a lot more detail about on our Brain Food Show podcast in the episode titled A Restaurant for a Beetle and $100 in a Bike, the fascinating stories behind 4 famous businesses, so go check that out. And that's not even to mention how prohibitively expensive it is to use a phone to call your kids and other family or correspond with a bank or a debt collector from prison. On top of the cost, there's also the extremely limited time that inmates are allowed to talk on the phone per day to anyone, even if they do have the money. Usually it's about 10 minutes, and that's not even going to get you past that automated phone system, is it? And this is all despite the fact that it has been conclusively proven that increased family communication while in prison markedly reduces the rate of recidivism among inmates. The prison system at work, everybody. As US Senator Brian Schatz recently noted, people in prison should not have to pay exorbitant fees just to talk on the phone with their kids, their clergy, or their counsel. It's bad for human rights, it's bad for our justice system, and it's bad for our taxpayers. Hear, hear, Brian. Moving swiftly on, one key difference between the way the American system works compared to the system in the UK is that bank accounts cannot be used directly by inmates to conduct personal banking transactions in the US. In contrast, in the UK, they can, and an individual can, transfer money from the prison account to a personal account or even to another person's account entirely to pay debts and the like. Again, this is not an option directly available to prisoners in the US. As Ed Rosser, spokesman for the Federal Bureau of Prisons, has noted, inmates can protect legitimate business interests by executing powers of attorney. We allow that to happen, but we do not facilitate inmates paying their bills. This all has to be scheduled from the outside. Any financial responsibility you have on the outside unrelated to your court orders, you're on your own. On this note, as one former inmate, Preston Love Jr., stated, "Before I went to jail, I had a car, cell phone, cable, and internet, credit cards, and many other bills and loans that were being paid. I contacted a few of the companies, but many of them said there wasn't anything they could do until I was in jail. Once I was in jail, there was still nothing they could do. I had people try to call and make arrangements for me, but they wouldn't allow them." Because of all of this, it's strongly recommended that before sentencing, you give someone on the outside official, full access to all of your finances and accounts. You could do this with something like a blanket power of attorney or even something as simple as a joint bank account. Again, this must be done before you're incarcerated because, as lawyer David O'Neill has stated, inmates can't set up bank accounts. We've called numerous banks, but they all tell us the same thing. You have to be physically present to set up bank accounts. Of course, while it's possible to give someone else control of your financial assets, such as a loved one, a lawyer, or a financial expert, there are pros and cons in each option. For example, transferring control of your financial assets to a loved one usually intentionally leaves them the ability to do pretty much whatever they want with your assets. This can be a good or bad thing depending on the person. To quote financial advisor Andrew Bernstein, "I tell people going in to get a reliable person, somebody that you trust your life with, and make them a power of attorney for your bills, for your home. Essentially, you're turning everything over to somebody else. It's got to be someone that's not going to screw you over." Of course, it's possible to limit this person's access to your money, but this may be a problem if they're only able to withdraw money and there's not enough money in the bank account and you can't add more. Given how powerless inmates are to do anything about it, things like identity theft and the trusted person running off with all the money is not terribly uncommon. Thus, for those who can afford it, it's often advisable to entrust a lawyer or a professional financial manager to handle things if you can. And if you're wondering, none of what we've discussed changes if you're sentenced to life in prison, and a person on the receiving end of such a sentence is still required to settle any and all debts. Then again, the data pretty clearly shows that one's credit score and paying one's debts is pretty low on the priority list of people who really think they're never going to be released from prison. However, occasionally people are paroled from even life sentences, so most lawyers strongly advise even those people to do their best to settle their financial obligations so that if they ever do get out, they're not going to get in trouble immediately. And just to quickly say that if someone does die in prison, it's pretty much the same situation as if they died outside of prison. Their remaining assets, if there are any, will be divided up in accordance with their will and debt obligations. The exception to all of this, though, is that if the authorities believe a person has benefited financially in some way from the crimes that they are accused of, in which case many governments, including the US and the UK, have broad authority to seize and distribute assets as they see fit. In the UK, for example, the 2002 Proceeds of Crime Act allows the authorities to distribute seized money and assets to charities. They can also use them to fund community projects in an area affected by crime, or even give the money directly to victims of a crime as a form of compensation. For the most part, though, assets are sold and the money is given to the government coffers for the purpose of fighting crime. This is essentially what happens in the US as well, with assets being sold at police auctions and things like that, with the money going back to the authorities in some cases, or also going to the state or the federal government. If the extent to which a person benefited financially from their crimes cannot be ascertained in both the US and the UK, the authorities will attempt to freeze their bank accounts, essentially preventing them from being used in any manner previously described while everything's being sorted out. The idea here is to prevent the individual from, say, sending the money abroad so the government can no longer easily seize it or something like that. If it's all sorted out and it's found that there's been no wrongdoing, the owner can then access the money again in the same limited way that a prisoner could access their normal accounts. Further, if you find yourself in prison and some debt collectors come a-calling, it's also possible that they'll be able to petition to have the money directly taken from your account without consent. For some inmates who might have no good way to settle a debt otherwise, this isn't necessarily a bad thing. But in a nutshell, if one is sentenced to life in prison or just a month, a person, depending on where they are in the world, usually has extremely limited access to their various assets behind bars, despite still being obligated to pay any bills and debts as if they were still gainfully employed and a free individual. But the chances are that you're watching this video in the free world and you're not paying through the nose for it. That is, unless you consider watching the 60-second advert for Dashlane being too much to pay, which some commenters clearly do think is the case. If that's you, do feel free to skip to another video right now. There's no bonus facts after this, it's just you supporting us. In the free world, you probably need Dashlane. They'll keep your online identity safe, maybe from those nefarious identity thieves who I imagine locked up in some sort of space prison for some reason. But seriously though, Dashlane will protect you from all sorts of threats to your identity. Lots of hackers out there, and the best way to keep yourself safe online is with Dashlane. Dashlane is a one-stop shop digital identity protection tool that includes a VPN for all of your devices so you can use public internet safely and anonymously. They also do something called dark web monitoring, which basically means they monitor the nasty underbelly of the web for people selling your data and will alert you if that is happening. Further, if a service you've signed up to, like Equifax or Sony or one of those others, suffers a breach, Dashlane will tell you right away, and they'll alert you to other services which share the same username and password so you can change it before hackers get access to other sites. Plus, Dashlane does what it's always done. It stores your passwords, it keeps your personal data secure, it fills in all of those annoying boxes for payment that the websites ask from you. It's all super easy. A lot of Dashlane is free, but there are some premium upgrades you can buy if you want more from the service. To see if those are right for you, you can do a 30-day free trial, and after that get 10% off by using our code, TodayIFoundOut, all one word, at dashlane.com/TodayIFoundOut. Alright, so just go protect yourself, click the link in the description below, and that's it. There's no bonus facts now, but I do appreciate you watching to the end and supporting this show, supporting Dashlane. So thank you for watching.